A brief history of the English language with stickmen. Our story begins in the early Iron Age with this tribe, the Celts. By 300 BC they had spread to here, but we're interested in these guys, the Britanni. They were the first people we know of to reach Britain, and so the land is named after them. Eventually they split off into these groups, and then into more groups, and then into more groups, but we don't care about that. The Britanni changed their name to the Brythonics because they thought it sounded cooler, and they wanted to attract investors. And so in 43 AD, the Romans arrived, and the existing tribes were pushed north and west. The Romans decided to call them all Britons to make life easier. The Romans brought with them science, architecture, and Jesus, who proved to be very popular. But then the Romans had to leave, and they left behind a whole lot of Latin. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and a power vacuum emerged. Enter the Anglo Saxons, who quickly turned up and filled the area previously occupied by Rome. The Angles took the north, and the Saxons took the south, but they pretty much all looked the same, especially to this guy. Bede was a monk who lived in Northumberland where the Angles lived, and he wrote a book about the history of his land, and since he couldn't tell them apart, he named the whole country after the Angles. Meanwhile, in the south, the Saxons started a bunch of small kingdoms, and the Celtic people started their own kingdoms in the west. And so Old English was born, which was a blend of the Germanic dialects brought from over the continent, but also with some Latin, since the Anglo-Saxons now also had Jesus, and it was a language of the Romans' science and technology that they could learn from. The Celts, by comparison, were regarded as a defeated people, with very little to teach them, so Celtic words in English are a lot more rare. And then the Vikings invaded. They turned up in the north of England, killed a bunch of people, and claimed half the country for themselves and called it the Danelaw. But they also brought buckets of Norse words over from Scandinavia to better explain why they were there. Then comes this guy. Alfred was king of Wessex as well as the High King of the Seven Kingdoms, and successfully fought off a Viking invasion into his lands and conquered these two smaller kingdoms while he was at it. Now, by this point, the main two languages being spoken in England besides English are Danish and Latin. But as Latin no longer has any native speakers, it is gradually becoming less relevant. Anyway, Alfred was big on education and promoting literacy. He wanted to make written English more popular and had a bunch of stuff written down that would later become known as the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. So then later, all the English kings decided to team up to get rid of the Vikings. And once they were all on the same side, they decided it would just be easier to have one big kingdom. They still had Jesus, so they speak a little Latin, and they still have written English thanks to Alfred, and everything was fine for a while. And then some bastard decided to invade England. The year is 1066. Edward the Confessor has died, and Harold Godwin has been crowned King of England. However, his brother, who also wanted to be king, paid some Vikings to invade, and so he had to march all the way north to fight them off. But then, William of Normandy invaded in the south, and he had to march all the way back again, and by that point was really tired and died, so the Normans conquered England. Now this is where it gets complicated. The situation in England is now that the king and his friends are speaking French, the church is speaking Latin, and the common folk are speaking English. English is now a third-rate language in its own country. Nobody's reading or writing in English anymore, and the story of English could have ended here, were it not for the Black Death, which killed 1 in 3 people in England in the 14th century, and basically all the French and Latin speakers died, so everyone had to go back to speaking English. Only now there's a metric ton of French words in English, and also the grammar has been tinkered with, and we find ourselves with Middle English. The influence of a Romance language on English brought poetry and song and some stories that weren't about fighting. However, Middle English spelling was a bloody mess, and this letter in particular proved tricky, so they decided to get rid of it, and that's why we've got all those silent GH words. Then in 1476, William Caxton brought the first printing press to England, which helped to organise spelling conventions and disseminate information more quickly. However, his typists were all Flemish, so when they were doing the Bible, they accidentally put a letter H in ghost. And once it was in the Bible, you don't argue with it. So that's why there's a letter H in ghost. Speaking of Bibles, there are various flavours of Christianity floating around Britain at this point, and everyone's got their own version of the Bible. So in 1604, King James decided to sit down and write a Bible that had everybody's favourite bits, and would work for everyone. From the KJV, we get a bunch of idioms that are still used in everyday speech. The King James Bible was so popular that nobody noticed that a man called Robert Corddry had published a table alphabetical, which was kind of like a dictionary, but not really. In In fact, people are paying a lot more attention to English these days, and between the Bible and the work of grammarians, they managed to make some rules, and English was upgraded to early modern English, which paved the way for this guy who you may have heard of, who came up with a bunch of new words all on his own to spice up his plays and sonnets. He also came up with some popular phrases, or maybe he didn't, and he was just the first to write them down. Meanwhile, all the clever clogsers of Europe were still speaking Latin, because they could exchange information with each other regardless of their native tongues. And also some Greek. So in the year 1660, the Latin-speaking Royal Society was founded, which is called the Royal Society despite the fact that it came shortly after a civil war where the king had been executed. Once the Royal Society decided that they could just speak English, the language got a bunch of fancy new science words like acid, momentum, and penis. Then there was a fire, which gave us the Latin phrase annus mirabilis and the nursery rhyme London's burning. Then Scotland and England got married and became the United Kingdom. And as with any marriage, communication was an issue. So Dr. Johnson published his dictionary, which took him 9 years and was the first book of its kind in any language, and featured this helpful definition for oats. By now, modern English is in full swing, so Britain decided that the whole world ought to know about it.
Just sail round the world and stick a flag in.
And they pilfered words from all across the globe as they went. One of the places they went was America, where they expanded, and then some of them fell out with the king, made a big cup of tea, and decided to start their own country. America was inventing words all on its own, and so Noah Webster decided to start his own dictionary and change some of the spellings to make it easier for them.
And then in the second half of the 20th century, the internet happened.
90% of which is in English, and most of the rest of it is in Japanese. We got lots of fancy computery words like firewall, laptop, and lol. So, between the British Empire, the American economy, and the internet, English secured itself as the world's first language, with influences from over 350 other languages, over 1 billion speakers depending on how you count, and the official language in 54 countries. And that's how English went from a 5th century Creole to the dominant language on the planet.